Over the past few months, I've developed a growing fascination with the corny, anthro, figure skating, battle, vampire cult conspiracy series from the minds of webtoon author wives Dea Muniz and Emily Ardos, titled Blades of Furry. And yeah, Furry on Ice was on the table for a bit, but that got shot down during development. And the reason this stands out to me so much is with how unusual this mix of elements sounds on paper. You'd expect this to be a series of convoluted Twilight Vampire Diary shenanigans that would constantly rise in stakes to the point of absurdity, and I would totally be down to read that, but it doesn't. For as unusual as this pitch sounds, it's a surprisingly grounded and personal story between the main characters Emil and Radu's relationship and their surrounding cast that takes this unfamiliar or even invented elements like this whole brand new ice sport that they created and ties them together in a clean and cohesive way. I've been following both of the authors for a pretty long time now, but the one I found first way back in 2014 was Dea Muniz. I even met them along with some other big name webtoon creators a few years ago, which is still a great memory. But what's more important here is I saw a bit of her master's thesis, which included this animatic, which was the first instance of this story before it was pitched to an editor at Webtoons. A lot of her portfolio work isn't really online anymore because the site went down. Right now, that clip is part of their Patreon for like $2, so it wouldn't be too difficult to see it for yourself, but for this video, I'll just note that that video follows the first two chapters of the webtoon almost beat for beat with some key differences. And it's those differences I want to touch on because they illustrate how they both turned a promising concept with a very abrupt ending into an engaging and complex series with some adjustments leading to unexpectedly specific but worthwhile relevant social commentary. And it's one that you can read online for free right now, which I do recommend you do first because there's going to be spoilers here. The first notable change is the scale of the characters. In the animatic, the scale was exaggerated and varied a little bit more than in the current series, with some of the designs staying mostly the same, but it also included 3 small bird characters who seemed to be giving some sort of pre-battle performance. They were like Disney animal-like, and they were later cut because the world that they were written into kind of relied on all of them being relatively people-shaped. It's clear the authors have some very specific passions they wanted to convey, most notably their love of simping for figure skaters. But to spice it up, they included a combat system which was based around building up points through performance, then potentially performing takedowns of similarly sized opponents by elegantly driving them into the ground. This extra danger is a cool concept that's intuitive to follow that never requires a point in the story to pause to explain those parameters. But when you include that it's a sport played by anthropomorphic animals, you can conceive of dozens of factors that would complicate the setup, like in that Kung Fu Panda style where each of the unique traits of each animal could drastically affect how they would perform on the ice, if you get what I mean. They do make a passing note of tails as a useful counterbalance, but clarifying that it wouldn't give them a huge advantage. And with most of the cast either involved directly or participating in the sport, leveling their relative scale instead of planning fights around those unique characteristics would help them illustrate a fair and accurate fight. I mean, they enjoy figure skating after all, so they'd want to portray it how they see it, right? All of this informs the art style, which I'll also note is a really nice blending of the elements of styles from both authors, where at the start you can point pretty clearly to who has more influence where, but levels out into a seamless and expressive blend as the story goes on, and all of those less pivotal elements have to be developed to both fit that style and fit within the world where this sport specifically exists and is a pretty dang big deal. Speaking of big deals, both the animatic and the opening chapters each have an announcer pointing out during the first battle we watched that Emil is a bona fide skating prodigy who has the potential to be the first rookie to rise through the ranks and earn gold on his first attempt. This is both really exciting for him, of course, but also can be incredibly stressful since any complications that arise could make achieving that unprecedented goal way more difficult. So of course, instead of just pairing him up with Radu at the start, like in the animatic, his intended opponent was injured and a reshuffling of the matches leads to him being up against the current bigger and larger deal Radu. So now, instead of just being scared because he has to fight someone he feels is way out of his league and kind of scary due to his current solitary brooding vampire but not really because he's a fruit bat wink persona, and his passionate admiration of him as an inspiration, he also has very little time to even mentally prepare and frantically points out all the ways Radu can effortlessly overtake him on the ice. And in the animatic, he does lose this fight, but if you remember before, I said it was a bit darker because in the original, Radu is he eats him. I mean, it cuts out right before that, but I saw this. He probably did bite. He probably did chomp him. but we couldn't really have that in the comic because we'd have no comic to read. So Radu's vampirism has to be recontextualized from an active threat to Emil and into an unexpected crutch for Radu himself. Instead of being this source of inhuman superpowers like a lot of vampire tropes tend to do, it's just a dietary restriction that comes from being part vampire bat and part fruit bat. I'm not a bat scientist, so I'll take their word for it there, but it severely limits the amount that he's able to eat without getting sick, which has to be a huge issue in an athletic setting, and apparently he gets real hangry too, which explains how aggressive he was on the ice. They do explain that the bloody drinks is in these disguised juice boxes that they source from cows, but I can't quite process the idea of regular animals also existing in this universe, so I'm just gonna gloss over that. So chances are this rearrangement of the opponents also made it really difficult for him to get the only food that he's able to drink before the next match, placing him at a notable disadvantage as well, one that Emil inadvertently takes advantage of, while strategizing escapes from his more sporadic and uncalculated attacks while gathering points in the areas he knows. And eventually he does get the upper hand and defeats him in a victory nobody saw coming. But afterwards, Radu approaches him and tries to explain some of what I mentioned before, like how he was just hungry and he didn't want to hurt him. I really appreciate this change towards making him a sympathetic character because it shows a strong amount of emotional vulnerability right off the bat. And it's nice to see that Emil respects him enough to take his word for it, even though he's still scared of him while he's reflecting on it. It's a really good start to their relationship because it shows an element of distrust, but one that they would eventually be able to overcome once they have a better understanding of each other. Also, his defeating of Radu draws a lot of eyes on both of them from the public, and especially those running the game, which is going to be a factor later on in the series. But unfortunately, there are still people who, even if they did fully understand the context, would never believe that Radu's innocent just by nature of being a vampire, and jump at the opportunity to condemn them publicly for their own benefit. And this is where the story and the implications of the text get a bit more complicated. Like I said before, the only notable difference this has in Radu's physical life is a slightly more difficult to manage shift in diet. It doesn't make him stronger or magical. I mean, technically garlic would make him sick, but basically every non-blood foodstuff does. And if he actually bit anyone, the vampirism wouldn't spread. It's purely a trait in his body. But even so, because of the outside perception of vampires, he and some of his family were terrified of the perception people would have of him because of the harm caused by a fringe radical group. There are people like Sue who actively conspire against him, trying to find proof and out him as a vampire in order to ruin his career and prospects, to justify her own selfish ambitions by convincing herself that it's not fair for him to be there because he's breaking the rules designed to keep him from competing, even though by every metric we've gone over, it literally has no effect on his ability to perform in that space, assuming, like, in his specific case, he has eaten, which I think is more of a case of being hangry, which can be perceived as a scary thing, but the story goes well out of its way to explain that that isn't the case. It's this bigotry that drives a lot of the conflict by forcing them to diligently keep this secret under wraps. It's the pursuit of this secret by Sue with her quote-unquote concerns and her logic behind doing so that feels more in line with the real-life conspiracy nuts. And even if you're going to point out that I said that Radu was violent in the original version, he's decidedly not in the final version, and that's kind of the point I've been trying to make here. I don't think it's a perfect execution, there's definitely ways of adjusting this even further, but I do think it works really well as a solution for the problem they were trying to solve here. Because in the original, that attack was a dead end, literally. The series could not progress if that aspect didn't get a massive rehaul, and it's those changes made to recontextualize that moment that lay out the foundation for the rest of the story's broader world. It directly changes the direction the two of them can take the story, and every change in detail, in my opinion, was for the better. Maybe there's some alternate timeline where Radu is actually the vicious monster we're supposed to see him as for the first little while, but that's not the story where all of the fun drama and heartwarming, sincere relationship developments that we get with the main duo happen. This is the one where we get that, and I'm gonna be honest, I like this version a lot better.